Avoidants always chase when this new version of you appears, not when you send the perfect text, not when you explain yourself one more time, not when you wait patiently, hoping they'll suddenly realize what they lost. The strange thing is that the moment many avoidants start paying attention again is often the exact moment you've stopped trying to get their attention at all. And if you've lived through this, you know how confusing it feels. One day, they seem distant, disconnected, impossible to reach. Then suddenly, after you've begun rebuilding your life, after you've started finding pieces of yourself you forgot existed, after you've stopped making them the center of your emotional world, they appear. A message, a reaction, a sudden curiosity, a sign of life from someone who once seemed determined to keep their distance. It's enough to make anyone wonder what changed. Was it something you said? Something you did? Or was it something much deeper than that? Today, we're diving into the psychological shift that makes this happen. And by the end, you may realize that the very thing you thought was pushing them away was actually preventing them from seeing your value in the first place. And if you've ever found yourself trapped in the exhausting cycle of chasing clarity from someone who keeps moving further away, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because these insights could completely change the way you see not only avoidance, but yourself. Most people assume attraction grows when you move closer. They think if they love harder, give more, explain better, stay longer, and prove their loyalty enough times, eventually the other person will recognize their worth. But with avoidant personalities, something unusual often happens. The more available you become, the more predictable the dynamic becomes, the less urgency exists. And when urgency disappears, so does a certain kind of curiosity. This doesn't mean avoidants don't care. It doesn't mean they never feel attachment. What it means is that emotional certainty can sometimes create the exact conditions that allow them to emotionally relax into distance. They begin unconsciously assuming that no matter how much space they take, no matter how inconsistent they become, you'll still be there. Not because they consciously decide to take you for granted, but because the pattern has taught them they can. And once that assumption settles into place, something important changes. They stop noticing what your presence actually contributes. It's like living beside a beautiful view every day until eventually you stop looking out the window. The view hasn't become less beautiful. You've simply become accustomed to it. Many people spend months or even years trying to become more valuable in the eyes of an avoidant, without realizing their value was never the issue. The issue was that their presence became so guaranteed that it no longer created awareness. Then comes the moment everything begins to shift. Not because of some strategy, not because of a manipulation tactic, but because exhaustion finally reaches its limit. There comes a day when you wake up and realize you're tired of analyzing every delayed reply, tired of decoding mixed signals, tired of carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be carried alone. And slowly, almost quietly, something inside you changes. You stop waiting, not out of anger, not out of revenge. You simply stop placing your life on hold. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's attention. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop treating their presence as the deciding factor in whether your day feels good or bad. And what makes this transformation so powerful is that it isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes nobody notices it at first. Not your friends, not your family, not even the avoidant. But the energy shifts. The emotional dependency begins dissolving. The invisible cord that kept you psychologically tethered starts loosening. Suddenly your focus expands beyond the relationship. Your thoughts aren't consumed by them every waking moment. Your emotional world starts belonging to you again. And strangely enough, this is often when avoidants begin sensing something different. They may not understand it consciously, they may not even realize why they're thinking about you more. But they feel the shift because the dynamic they became accustomed to is no longer operating the same way. As that waiting ends, another transformation emerges. You become the main character in your own life again. For so long, your energy may have been directed outward. How are they feeling? What are they thinking? Why did they say that? What does this mean? But now the spotlight begins returning to where it always belonged. You start investing in goals that have nothing to do with them. You reconnect with passions that existed before the relationship consumed your attention. You spend time with people who make you feel alive. You develop routines that strengthen your body, challenge your mind, and restore your confidence. And perhaps most importantly, you begin creating memories that don't include them. This is where many avoidants become unexpectedly curious, because they were familiar with the version of you that revolved around the connection. They understood that version. They knew how that version would respond. But now they're witnessing someone who seems engaged in a life that exists independently of them. Someone who isn't standing still. someone who isn't waiting for permission to move forward. This isn't about pretending to be happy. It's not about posting carefully crafted updates designed to provoke jealousy. It's about becoming genuinely invested in your own existence again. And authentic growth carries a completely different energy than performative growth. People can feel the difference, especially those who once assumed your world would continue orbiting around them indefinitely. What often follows is the emergence of a confidence they don't quite recognize. Not loud confidence, not arrogance, not the confidence that constantly announces itself. This is quieter, stronger, more grounded. It's the confidence that develops when you survive disappointment and discover you can still thrive. The confidence that comes from facing loneliness and realizing it won't destroy you. The confidence that appears when your self-worth stops depending on another person's choices. Avoidants frequently become accustomed to seeing people through a specific lens. They remember who you were when you were seeking reassurance. They remember who you were when uncertainty controlled your emotions. They remember who you were when their approval mattered too much. But this new version doesn't operate from that place anymore. This version speaks differently, carries themselves differently, and responds differently. They no longer chase validation because they have begun creating it internally. And that shift is powerful because it cannot be faked for long. Genuine confidence isn't something you perform. It's something people feel when your actions consistently align with your value. Suddenly, the avoidant is looking at someone familiar who somehow feels unfamiliar at the same time. Someone they thought they understood completely now contains layers they never noticed before. And that is often where curiosity begins. Not because you tried harder, not because you loved harder, but because the person standing before them is no longer defined by the need to be chosen. The person standing before them has started choosing themselves. And once you reach that point, something even more important begins to happen. You stop needing their validation. This sounds simple on the surface, but for many people, it is one of the hardest emotional shifts they will ever make. Because when you've spent months or years hoping someone will finally choose you, understand you, commit to you, or show up consistently for you, their approval starts feeling like proof of your worth. Their attention feels like confirmation that you matter. Their silence feels like rejection. Their affection feels like relief. Without realizing it, your emotional state becomes connected to someone else's behavior. But the new version of you gradually breaks that connection. You begin recognizing that your value existed long before they entered your life and will continue long after they leave it. You stop seeing yourself through their eyes and start seeing yourself through your own. The fascinating thing is that avoidants often notice this shift before anyone says a word about it. They notice when compliments no longer seem desperately needed. They notice when their attention no longer creates the same dramatic emotional reaction. They notice when your identity stops revolving around their opinion. And for someone accustomed to being a central emotional reference point in the dynamic, this can be surprisingly unsettling. Not because they want power over you, but because the familiar emotional structure has changed. Suddenly, they are interacting with someone who is emotionally standing on their own feet. Someone who wants connection but doesn't require it in order to feel whole. And that kind of independence carries a magnetic quality that cannot be manufactured. As this transformation deepens, another psychological force quietly enters the picture: scarcity. Now, this is where many people misunderstand what actually happens. Scarcity is not about intentionally becoming unavailable. It's not about ignoring messages for strategic reasons or pretending not to care. Real scarcity happens naturally when your life becomes genuinely full again. Your time is no longer dominated by thoughts of them. Your schedule contains experiences that matter to you. Your energy is invested in things that nourish your future rather than endlessly revisiting the past. The result is that access to you changes. The emotional availability that once existed around the clock is no longer automatically there. Not because you're withholding it, but because your life now contains other priorities. And human beings often become most aware of value when access changes. Think about how often people overlook something while it is constantly available, only to recognize its importance once it becomes less accessible. Avoidants are not immune to this reality. In fact, because many avoidants are highly sensitive to pressure but responsive to freedom, they sometimes become more curious when they feel space rather than pursuit. The certainty that once surrounded your presence begins disappearing. Questions emerge. What are they doing now? Who are they becoming? Why does their energy feel different? These questions aren't always conscious, but they begin creating movement where there was previously emotional complacency. What was once assumed is now uncertain, and uncertainty has a way of capturing attention. Then comes another shift that many people underestimate. You stop reacting to every signal. In the past, a delayed message could ruin your day. A vague comment could send your mind into overdrive. A small sign of interest could instantly reignite hope. Every breadcrumb felt meaningful because you were searching for answers. But the new version of you no longer lives in a constant state of reaction. You begin observing rather than chasing. You stop demanding explanations for every inconsistency. You stop engaging in exhausting emotional investigations. You stop trying to force clarity from someone who isn't ready to provide it. This is not emotional coldness. It's emotional maturity. It means you've learned that not every action requires a response. Not every silence requires interpretation. Not every mixed signal deserves your energy. And when this happens, the dynamic changes dramatically. Avoidants often expect certain responses because those responses have become part of the established pattern. They expect pursuit after distance. They expect questions after withdrawal. They expect emotional intensity after inconsistency. But when those reactions disappear, something unexpected happens. The script they unconsciously relied upon no longer functions. Suddenly there is space where predictable behavior used to exist. And within that space, curiosity begins growing. Because people often pay closer attention when the responses they expected no longer arrive. At the same time, something else returns to your presence: mystery. Not the artificial mystery created through games and manipulation. Not the calculated mystery promoted by social media advice. Genuine mystery. The kind that naturally emerges when someone is fully engaged in their own life. One of the reasons relationships become predictable is that every thought, feeling, and activity gets reported in real time. There are no surprises, no discoveries, no unfolding chapters. Everything is immediately available. But when you become immersed in your own growth, that changes. You stop broadcasting every internal experience. You stop organizing your life around being seen by a specific person. Your world becomes richer, deeper, and more expansive. New interests appear. New perspectives develop. New experiences shape you. And because these changes are happening authentically, they create a version of you that feels layered and evolving. Avoidants who once believed they had you completely figured out suddenly realize they don't know everything anymore. They don't know what occupies your mind when you're alone. They don't know what goals excite you now. They don't know who you've become in the spaces where they are absent. And that uncertainty often sparks attention, because human beings are naturally drawn toward discovery. We become interested in what continues revealing new dimensions. The mystery isn't manufactured. It's the natural result of personal evolution. But perhaps the most powerful transformation of all is your emotional stability, because beneath every previous change lies this deeper foundation. Emotional stability is what happens when your peace stops depending on someone else's consistency. It doesn't mean you never feel sadness. It doesn't mean rejection stops hurting. It doesn't mean disappointment magically disappears. What it means is that those experiences no longer control your entire identity. You develop the ability to feel difficult emotions without becoming consumed by them. You learn how to remain grounded when circumstances are uncertain. You stop allowing another person's behavior to dictate your sense of self. And this creates a presence that feels remarkably different. Before, your emotional state may have risen and fallen based on every interaction. Now, there is a steadiness to you, a calmness, a quiet strength. You become less reactive, less fragile, less dependent on external reassurance. And this is often where avoidants begin feeling something they cannot easily explain. Because emotional stability creates safety. It communicates that you are no longer trying to pull them into emotional situations they fear they cannot manage. It shows that you are capable of standing independently while still remaining open-hearted. In many cases, this is the exact version of you they never expected to meet. Not the version desperately trying to hold on, not the version waiting to be rescued, but the version who has discovered their own center. The version who remains connected to themselves regardless of who stays, who leaves, or who comes back. And when an avoidant encounters that version of you, the dynamic they once understood begins changing in ways neither of you could have predicted. What makes this stage so fascinating is that the changes happening inside you are not only affecting your life, they are also quietly dismantling assumptions that may have existed for a very long time. One of the most powerful assumptions an avoidant can develop is the belief that certain people will always remain emotionally available regardless of what happens. Not because they consciously plan it that way, but because repeated patterns create expectations. If someone has always been the one reaching out first, always trying to repair conflict, always keeping the connection alive, eventually that effort can become part of the emotional background. It starts feeling permanent, predictable, guaranteed. But when the new version of you appears, those assumptions begin cracking. The avoidant starts noticing that the emotional safety net they unconsciously counted on is no longer functioning in the same way. You are still kind, still caring, still yourself. but you are no longer organizing your life around maintaining access to someone who is uncertain about maintaining access to you. And this creates a strange psychological experience. For the first time, they may have to confront the possibility that your attention is not infinite, that your loyalty is not unconditional access, that your emotional energy is a valuable resource rather than an endlessly renewable one. Suddenly, they are no longer responding to the version of you they memorized months or years ago. They are standing in front of someone whose boundaries have changed, whose priorities have evolved, and whose future no longer seems permanently connected to their choices. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it forces a reassessment of everything they previously took for granted. And once those assumptions begin falling apart, another emotional force often enters the picture: fear of missing out. Now, this is not the shallow version people usually talk about. This isn't about seeing you with someone else and feeling jealous. It's much deeper than that. It's the realization that a person who once occupied a familiar place in your life is becoming someone entirely new. Many avoidants process emotions in delayed waves. While others may feel loss immediately, avoidants often create distance first and experience the emotional impact later. During the period of separation, they may feel relief, freedom, or emotional quiet. But as time passes and your transformation becomes more visible, the reality of what is changing begins catching up with them. They start seeing evidence that life is moving forward without them, not in a dramatic way, not in a way designed to hurt them, simply in a real way. They notice that your happiness is no longer dependent on their participation. They notice that opportunities continue arriving, friendships continue growing, personal goals continue unfolding, and somewhere beneath the surface, a question begins forming. What happens if this version of you keeps evolving? What happens if the person they once knew becomes someone they can no longer access? What happens if the connection they assumed would always be available eventually disappears entirely? Fear of missing out is not always about wanting someone back. Sometimes it's about realizing their importance only after you've stopped assuming they will always remain within reach. And for avoidants, who often struggle with delayed emotional awareness, this realization can arrive with surprising intensity. At the same time, something else is happening that many people never recognize. You are becoming harder to categorize. Human beings naturally create mental versions of the people around them. We place them into familiar roles and predictable identities because it helps us understand the world. Avoidants do this too. They build internal images of who people are, how they behave, and what they can expect from them. But personal growth disrupts those images. The more you evolve, the more difficult it becomes for others to fit you into the old categories they created. The avoidant who once saw you as the person always seeking reassurance now encounters someone emotionally self-sufficient. The avoidant who once saw you as endlessly available now encounters someone with a rich and meaningful life. The avoidant who once assumed they understood every reaction now finds themselves unable to predict what you'll do next. This creates a fascinating tension because familiarity and unfamiliarity begin existing at the same time. They recognize you, but they don't fully understand you anymore. They remember who you were, but they can also see evidence that you are becoming someone else. And human beings are naturally drawn toward complexity. We become curious when a person no longer fits neatly inside the box we created for them. Every conversation feels slightly different. Every interaction contains new dimensions. Every encounter reveals another layer that wasn't visible before. Without intending to, you've become a living reminder that growth changes everything. And that change often captures attention far more effectively than any attempt to prove your worth ever could. As your transformation continues, one quality begins radiating through everything you do: self-respect, not pride, not superiority, not emotional walls disguised as strength, real self-respect, the kind that develops when you finally understand your own value. Self-respect changes how you speak. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you chase and what you walk away from. Most importantly, it changes the standards you hold for your own life. For a long time, many people confuse self-sacrifice with love. They believe enduring endless uncertainty proves commitment. They believe abandoning their needs demonstrates loyalty. They believe accepting less than they deserve will somehow earn greater affection. But self-respect teaches a different lesson. It teaches that healthy love does not require the abandonment of self. It teaches that boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. It teaches that choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. And people can feel this energy even when nothing is explicitly said. They can feel it in the way you carry yourself, in the way you respond to disappointment, in the way you refuse to bargain for basic respect. Avoidants often notice this shift because it changes the emotional atmosphere of every interaction. You are no longer negotiating your worth. You are no longer trying to convince someone to see your value. You know your value, and that certainty creates a presence that is both calming and powerful. It communicates something words rarely can, that your life will continue moving forward regardless of who decides to join the journey. This is also the moment many people finally understand why chasing never produced the outcome they hoped for. Looking back, they realize that every attempt to force connection only pulled them further away from themselves. Every desperate effort to gain certainty created more anxiety. Every attempt to prove their worth unintentionally communicated doubt about their worth. Chasing feels logical when you're afraid of losing someone. It feels like action. It feels productive. It feels like love. But most of the time, chasing is driven by fear rather than connection. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being forgotten, and fear rarely creates the energy that healthy relationships require. The irony is that the thing that often captures an avoidant's attention isn't pursuit at all. It's transformation. It's becoming someone whose happiness is no longer dependent on the outcome. It's creating a life so meaningful that whether someone stays or leaves no longer determines your identity. And when you reach that point, something extraordinary happens. You stop focusing on how to make them chase you. You stop asking how to regain their interest. You stop trying to control their choices, because your attention has shifted towards something infinitely more important, becoming the person you were meant to become. And from that place, the entire dynamic changes, not because you've mastered a technique, but because you've outgrown the need for one. And perhaps the clearest sign that you have truly changed arrives when you no longer need closure in order to move forward. For a long time, closure may have felt like the missing piece. You wanted the explanation, the conversation, the apology. You wanted the perfect final chapter that would make everything make sense. You believed that once you received those answers, peace would finally arrive. But as your growth deepens, you begin discovering something surprising. Peace was never hidden inside another person's explanation. It was hidden inside your ability to accept what happened without requiring every question to be answered. You start understanding that some people leave confusion behind because they are confused themselves. Some people cannot offer clarity because they do not possess it. Some people walk away without providing the ending you deserved. And while that reality is painful, it is also liberating. Because the moment you stop waiting for someone else to release you, you release yourself. You stop replaying old conversations in search of hidden meanings. You stop imagining future discussions that may never happen. You stop placing your healing on hold until another person decides to participate in it. And this creates a level of emotional freedom that many avoidants have never seen in you before. The version of you they once knew was still looking backward. This version is looking ahead. This version understands that unanswered questions do not have the power to stop a life from moving forward. And when someone who once carried emotional weight with both hands suddenly begins walking without it, people notice. As a result, something fascinating often begins happening inside the avoidant's mind. They start seeing your value differently, not because your value has increased, but because their perspective has changed. One of the strange realities of human psychology is that familiarity can sometimes hide appreciation. When someone is constantly present, constantly giving, constantly available, their contributions can become invisible, not because they lack importance, but because they become expected. Yet once distance enters the picture and your growth becomes undeniable, the avoidant may begin revisiting memories from a completely different angle. They start remembering the consistency they once overlooked, the support they once assumed would always exist, the understanding they rarely acknowledged, the emotional safety they quietly benefited from. Suddenly, experiences that felt ordinary in the moment begin carrying new significance. This is why people sometimes recognize value only after circumstances change. It's not that the value suddenly appeared, it's that the conditions preventing them from seeing it have disappeared. And for avoidants, who often process emotions through reflection rather than immediate awareness, this delayed realization can feel surprisingly powerful. They begin comparing the version of life that included you with the reality they currently occupy. They begin noticing the absence of qualities they once treated as permanent. They begin recognizing that what they had access to was far rarer than they originally understood. And from that realization, a new kind of attention often emerges. That attention frequently leads to something many viewers of this video have experienced firsthand: the return attempt. Sometimes it arrives dramatically. Sometimes it arrives quietly. A message after months of silence. A reaction to something you posted. A casual question that feels strangely out of place after such a long absence. A sudden effort to reconnect from someone who once seemed determined to create distance. And when this happens, it can feel incredibly validating. After all, for so long you wondered whether they would ever realize what they lost. Now there they are, reappearing exactly when you've begun creating a life beyond them. But this is where emotional maturity becomes essential, because not every return means the same thing. Some avoidants return because they genuinely miss the connection. Some return because curiosity has resurfaced. Some return because they sense your growth and want to understand it. Some return because loneliness has appeared. Some return because they miss the comfort you provided. And some return because your transformation has challenged assumptions they once held about you. The key is understanding that a return is information, not a conclusion. It tells you that something has changed in their awareness. It does not automatically tell you what has changed in their capacity. Those are two very different things. Awareness can arrive quickly. Lasting change often takes much longer. And if you have spent months becoming stronger, wiser, and more grounded, you owe it to yourself to evaluate actions rather than becoming swept away by the emotional excitement of renewed attention. Which brings us to the test that so many people fail. Not because they are weak, not because they lack intelligence, but because hope can be incredibly persuasive. The moment the avoidant returns, there is often a powerful temptation to abandon all the growth that brought you here. Suddenly, old habits begin whispering in the background. The urge to overgive returns. The urge to ignore red flags returns. The urge to make someone else's needs more important than your own returns. It can happen so quickly that people barely notice it. One message becomes constant availability. One positive interaction becomes emotional investment. One small sign of effort becomes justification for lowering standards that took months to build. This is why the return itself is not the final challenge. Maintaining the new version of yourself is. Can you remain grounded while they are present, not only when they are absent? Can you maintain boundaries even when receiving the attention you once desperately wanted? Can you remember your worth when old emotions begin resurfacing? These questions matter because genuine transformation is not proven by how you behave during separation. It is proven by how you behave when temptation returns. Anyone can feel strong when there is no opportunity to fall back into old patterns. Real growth is revealed when the opportunity arrives and you consciously choose a different path. And that leads us to the deepest truth behind everything we've explored today. The real reason avoidants often begin chasing when this new version of you appears has very little to do with tactics, strategies, or psychological tricks. It has everything to do with transformation. The old version of you was focused on obtaining something from them, their attention, their commitment, their validation, their certainty. The new version of you has discovered something far more valuable, yourself. You are no longer trying to fill an internal void through another person's choices. You are no longer waiting for someone else to determine whether your life can move forward. You have become emotionally available to yourself. You have become invested in your own future. You have become someone who understands that love should add to your life, not become your entire life. And that shift changes everything. Because whether the avoidant returns or not, you win. If they never come back, you still have the life you've built. If they do come back, you meet them from a place of strength rather than desperation. Either way, the outcome no longer controls your identity, and that is the irony hidden at the center of this entire journey. The moment many avoidants start chasing is often the moment you've stopped needing to be chased at all. Not because you've become colder, not because you've become unavailable, but because you've become whole. You've become someone whose happiness is no longer held hostage by another person's fears, inconsistencies, or uncertainties. And in the end, that is the version of you that changes the dynamic forever. Not the version that waited. Not the version that chased. Not the version that begged to be chosen. The version that finally chose themselves.